Hello, family heads, and welcome to another installment of Family Vacation, the show in between the series. I'm your host for the week, Matt Glass, and today we're going to be talking about a very interesting album by a very interesting band. A band that has a history so elaborate that I don't even think I could cover it in an hour-long episode of the Family album. Yes, we are talking about the Mountain Goats, specifically the polished era of the Mountain Goats. For those who are unaware, the Mountain Goats, despite its moniker suggesting there are more people, was actually one person in the studio for a very long time. And by in the studio, I mean that just to add some flair, because he did not work in a studio. John Darnielle was the sole member of the Mountain Goats for a very, very long time and is now the front man. He has since acquired Peter Hughes on bass and backup vocals, John Worster on drums, and Matt Douglas on other backup vocals, flute, saxophone, clarinet, and keys. A very talented bunch they all are. Despite the Mountain Goats not having a polished sound for a number of years until the 2000s, people loved the words of John Darnielle and all of his insights as well as criticisms on social life. One of my favorite tracks by the Mountain Goats is actually one of the unpolished era songs, known as Golden Boy. You could probably take like any one of his unpolished songs and use that as an intro because he has a lot of really good lyrical material. But eventually he wanted to up the ante and start making records that sound a bit more put together. This record is actually well into the polished era though. We are talking about the Mountain Goats' 16th studio album, Goths. Released on May 19th of 2017 through Merge Records, it is produced by Brandon Eggleston and Scott Solter. The record covers a bit of a coming-of-age story of a teenager trying to embrace gothic culture of the 90s, much like Darnielle wished he could when he was a child. Heavy influences from The Cure, Susie and the Banshees, and even Gene Loves Jezebel. There's a whole song dedicated to them. It's all primarily seen in their lyrics. Now, I'm sure at this point you're probably wondering what genre the Mountain Goats are. And they're actually indie folk, indie rock, folk rock, and for a large portion of their discography, lo-fi. But here's the kicker. This album has, in my opinion, a bit of a special treat added to it. Despite this album talking extensively about matching with the goth culture of the 90s and taking direct lyrical inspiration from the bands I mentioned before, this album is a jazz album. Now, it's speculated that the reason why they went in this direction was actually because John Darnielle, who not only does lead vocals but the guitar, was suffering from tendinitis. So in an effort to think outside the box and deliver, they tried to sort of expand their horizons on what kind of music they can create. And boy, did they create. Despite this album having like no guitars all across, I thoroughly enjoyed this because all of the instruments are perfectly in line with one another. But you know how these episodes are, let's hop into it. Starting with musicality, I gotta say I was really pleasantly surprised with the arrangements on this record. Prior to this, I had never listened to a full album by the Mountain Goats, just a lot of miscellaneous songs. When you think of gothic culture, you don't necessarily think of a gothic album primarily comprised of smooth jazz and even yacht pop. What this album lacks in guitars, it makes up for in successful saxophone leads and very padded out comping of the keys. Every single track also has a lot of garnished moments where the woodwinds just sort of lightly feather the arrangements. The band's synergy with one another can definitely be awarded by me too. The musicianship between the band members is to be applauded. None of the instruments are outplaying each other in any of the arrangements, despite how many solos there are on each track. I simply adore the wind solo at the end of track 3, the Grey King and the Silver Flame attunement. I love the way that the drums just absolutely ground this atmospheric feel that the woodwinds swirl around in the mix. The drummer, John Worster, is an absolute fucking powerhouse on every track. As a final note, I'd like to acknowledge how well this record balances consistency in sound with variety. Despite these songs sounding like they belong on the same record, you don't feel absolutely pressed down by anything really repetitive, and each song is serviceable by itself where you can really just listen to it alone. But that's all I have to really say about musicality. Let's move on to production. In terms of production, this album is fairly standard. I really didn't notice anything particularly strange or any weird choices that took me out of the experience. The horns, the winds, the keys, they're all emphasized enough in each track, but not in a way that overpowers the other instruments like I mentioned before. Given how the album does not have a lick of guitar, I respect the attempts to fill the space up in any kind of way. with whatever leading instrument they got. I love the production on track 2. Andrew Eldritch is moving back to leads. It's got a major emphasis on E-piano being in the center of the mix, and it just sounds really good and it's really groovy. Curiously, although the song is one of my favorites, it contains the only audio hiccup throughout the entire record. It's a very rough plosive on the lyric, "No one anticipates the rush." I genuinely wonder why they let that in, but in spite of that, I actually think the song is a top 3. Not of all time, like on the record. I bet it was just an inflection thing and he thought, you know what? Passion. There it is. Let's dive into lyrics now. The album lyrically became something that I grew to really appreciate with every listen. While it's written to be pretty direct in carrying out the storytelling, it's nothing short of decently self-contained. In terms of themes, the record makes an effort to try and encapsulate the lifestyle of being goth, coinciding with youthful themes of adolescence, specifically the teenage years. I actually really like the whole teenagers thinking they understand the world and everything in it mentality that this record just so blatantly displays. This paired with the idea that the kids are doing this in a city where cities have a much different vibe than if you're going to carry this out in the suburbs, especially a dangerous city setting like it describes in many of the tracks. Later on in the record, the story eventually shifts over to a narrative about a goth band trying to make a killing in the music industry while also making a name for themselves in general. I'm a fan of the majority of this record, but the track that actually grew on me the most was Rage of Travers, where it directly talks about this goth group bombing, and then in spite of that, it sort of plays out to the end of the record, them trying their hardest to push forward because of that. Though, it doesn't really work out. With the final track, Abandoned Flesh, it actually talks about Gene loves Jezebel and their sort of falling out story, which I'm guessing is supposed to be synonymous with the band that Darnielle had made for the story. Eventually, reality would have to take over, they would have to grow up and abandon the goth lifestyle. Despite this final track not really being my favorite, I think it's artfully done in telling how fads and like trends for a while, depending on how deep you're able to get in, can easily be fallen out of depending on your circumstances. It's different for everybody. Eventually, life keeps going and people change. Now, let's get to vocals. Despite Darnielle's particular vocal style, I was definitely pleased with how smoothly he was able to adapt to different genre bends. His vocals, especially when he projects, can be seen as a little sharp and to some, maybe even containing a tinge of sourness. Based upon my experiences following the band, I've come to appreciate how sincere it makes its lyrics sound. When he really dips into more nasally portions of his voice, I personally can feel the authenticity. With a lot of the lyrics describing things he idolized in his youth about fantasy and goth culture, his rather scratchy and thin vocals also add to the vibe. But what definitely impressed me was how much he committed to each track individually, almost as if he was trying to stick to a character he was playing. For the record in particular, I found that his adaptation between tracks added to the overall immersion of the story. Finally, I'm going to talk about album flow. This album is 5 minutes short of an hour, which was a little bit of a concern to me when I started listening because my target maximum of album runtime is typically like 40 minutes or so. But I will say, it did not matter. I felt like this was paced pretty well. I will say though, this might be a little misleading for people who really like goth culture if you're looking for both content and sound, because although the juxtaposed idea of this being a jazz lounge album about gothic assimilation, I would definitely say that people might not like that. Though it's also like they don't really get it, I feel. I think the dissonance between this album's sound and its content is honestly pretty funny and it really works. For true fans of music associated with goth culture, I could definitely see this album as fatiguing. But given the fact that I am new to a lot of this culture myself, I was honestly enthralled by this listening experience. I thought it was clever to see the band work in a non-rock format especially. I feel this made elements such as the lyrics, vocals, and even the overall content of the record pop out at me, to which now I want to look into a lot of these references. None of the tracks are bloated, but if you want something more tonally and sonically hard-hitting, you may want to only listen to the first track, Rain in Soho, which somehow perfectly sets the tone and is a complete red herring from what you would expect of this record. It's this sort of like thumping, like ominous, like nobody knows what's out there kind of track. And it's amazing. It's actually probably also in the top 5 or so for me. All right, guys, I guess I'll get to my final ranking. So, to start off, I'm actually getting a call on my office phone. Let's see who it is. Hello, you've reached Matt Glass. Oh, sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to leave it ringing for too long. I understand. Punctuality was part of my resume, and you expect me to uphold that responsibility. Yeah, I was just recording my episode, and I was about to get to my final ranking, and oh, you know? You've been watching me? Installing cameras in my house was part of the contract? Oh, okay, got it. Cool. Oh, yeah, about my Bleachers review. I figured, like, I didn't really want to talk about the bonus tracks if they didn't have any real meaning, and I didn't really want to go through the weeds and trying to figure out whether or not I even... Oh, so that was unacceptable, and it breached my contract agreement as a music critic. Got it. Okay, cool. Additional business? You want me to take care of your pet scorpion while you're in the business conference in Honolulu, Hawaii? It's in the contract that I specifically have to bathe him 3 times a day? And lather, rinse, and repeat? Sir, I feel like this kind of violates a lot of things in my... Wait, how much of a raise will you give me? Well, okay, sir, I guess I'll finish up this review as quickly as I can so I can give good old Martin Scorsese the bath he deserves. All right, thank you, sir. Oh, yes, and okay, I won't forget about the bonus tracks this time. Got it. Cool. Okay, sorry about that, family heads. Me and AJ have been trying to make more of a killing in the podcasting industry, so we got the chance to sign a bunch of contracts, and I guess now I'm taking care of a scorpion this weekend. But so I don't breach the contract like my boss said, I'm going to talk about the 4 bonus tracks on the deluxe version. So the deluxe version of Goths was actually released on the same day, May 19th of 2017, and it includes 4 more tracks, all these sort of ominous ambient, soundscapes, for a lack of a better word. It sounds like a bunch of mellow jamming on piano, bass, and even some choir vocals, which I was really surprised about. The first one's actually called For the West Coast Dark Ambient Bedroom Warrior, then it's Scaling the Well, then Vanishing Act, which is a really heavenly one, and then Grave Dust, which is another bonus track that's pretty ominous. And they're all pretty good for what they offer. Nothing too amazing, in my opinion. But if you were looking for more content on this record, I think the last 4 bonus tracks are definitely worth the listen. They don't really add much to the story, but when you look at the whole record as a whole and see all of the lavish and lush instrumentals, it's kind of cool to have 4 additional things that might have you imagine some other additions to the story. My favorite one, personally, is Vanishing Act because it sounds really heavenly and I like the way that it carries itself, especially with those choir vocals. It's incredible. Overall, I have to say that this record was a very enjoyable listen, and I love all the creative directions that Darnielle decided to include. Given the limitations on his guitar playing, I think it couldn't have worked out better in his execution of juxtaposing such a distinct culture associated with a particular sound of music with a genre that just completely not be associated with that culture. I mean, the last thing you would expect for a song about surviving as a goth in a giant city would be something that sounds like it came off of the Frasier soundtrack on track 8, Paid in Cocaine. All that aside, the instrumentals are just absolutely brilliant, and the band members just knew exactly how to really work together. It doesn't really stop at music though. Darnielle's vocals are able to somehow blend amongst the scene that the music is providing, and it has lyrics that brilliantly go against everything you're hearing, but in a way that's tasteful and intentional. My favorite 3 tracks from lowest to highest have to include Rain in Soho, Andrew Eldritch is moving back to Leeds, and Wear Black. But there were a few of them that could have easily have surpassed all 3 of these. To cap it all off, I'm gonna put it in B+ tier and give it a, I think, pretty fairly deserved 7.9 out of 10. I'm very excited to see what other stuff they have in their discography, both old, new, polished, or unpolished. Well, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this episode. I'm very happy that I covered a Mountain Goats album finally, and let me know what you guys want us to do next. I mean, me and AJ, like I said before, we're trying to feel out Family Vacation, and we want to go by whatever you guys want us to do. So let us know on our Instagram. We might try to do some polls. Interact with us. We're going to try to do Instagram stuff, even though we've been saying that for who knows how long. But as always, I'm your host, Matt Glass. Have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful week. And AJ, you're up next. Peace!